Feel the temperature rise as we dive into the most intense and heated confrontations of the human experience. This is high-stakes drama where the pressure is real and the consequences are final. Subscribe now and watch the mercury rise to its breaking point today.
It was 6:47 in the morning when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I almost didn't check it. I'd been up late the night before finishing a report for work, and I was in that half-asleep place where sounds feel far away and nothing feels urgent. But something made me reach for it. Maybe instinct. Maybe the same instinct that made me install that doorbell camera 3 months earlier when my neighbor's package got stolen. The notification said, "Motion detected at front door." I opened the app still half asleep, squinting at the screen. The footage was grainy in the early morning light, but I recognized the car immediately. My uncle's silver sedan, the one with the dent on the passenger side he never got fixed. I watched him get out. Then I watched my aunt get out. Then I watched my aunt get out. Then I watched them open the back door and help someone out of the back seat, slowly, carefully. And I sat straight up in bed. It was my grandmother. She was wearing her blue cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons she saves for church. She had a rolling suitcase. My uncle set it on the porch, said something to her I couldn't hear, and then they both got back in the car and drove away. I was already out of bed before I fully understood what I was seeing. I grabbed a sweatshirt off the floor, didn't bother with shoes, and ran downstairs. When I opened the front door, she was just standing there on the porch, with her hands folded in front of her, the suitcase handle still in her grip. 41 degrees. She wasn't wearing a coat. She looked up at me, and the first thing she said was, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't know where else to go." Her name is Ruth. She's 81 years old. And she'd been standing on my porch for 11 minutes by the time I opened that door. I didn't ask questions right then. I just pulled her inside, sat her on the couch, turned the heat up, and made her tea. Her hands were cold when I wrapped mine around them. She was trying not to cry, and I could tell she'd been trying not to cry for a long time. Her eyes had that tired look, the kind that isn't from one bad night, but from a lot of them stacked on top of each other. I sat across from her and I waited. She started slowly. She told me she'd been asking my uncle, her son, for weeks to take her to her doctor's appointment. He kept saying he would. He kept not doing it. She'd been out of one of her blood pressure medications for 9 days. 9 days. She told me she'd mentioned it 3 times at the dinner table, and each time he said he'd handle it. She finally called the pharmacy herself to ask if they could mail it, and they told her the prescription needed a doctor's authorization first. Then she told me about the money. I want to be careful here about how I say this, because for a long time I convinced myself I was misunderstanding the situation. I told myself there had to be an explanation. My uncle had been managing my grandmother's finances for 2 years, since she had a small stroke that didn't leave lasting damage, but scared everyone enough that she agreed to let someone help her. She can still hold a full conversation, still does her own crossword puzzles every morning, still beats me at Scrabble. But she trusted him. That was her only mistake. She told me she'd asked him last month to transfer some money from her savings account so she could give a small gift to my cousin for her college graduation. He told her the account was tied up and that she shouldn't worry about it. She let it go. Then she asked him about her phone bill, because she'd gotten a notice saying it was past due, and he told her she must have misread it. She hadn't misread it. 2 days later, her phone was shut off, and a neighbor had to drive her to a store to get a prepaid phone just so she could call people. That was 2 weeks ago. I hadn't heard from her in 2 weeks, and I'd assumed she was just busy. I asked her if she knew how much was in her savings account. She said she used to have a little over $90,000 in there, money she'd saved her entire life, money from my grandfather's life insurance when he passed. Money she'd been careful with for 30 years. She said she didn't know anymore. She said every time she asked, my uncle got agitated, and she didn't want to cause problems. I excused myself and went to the kitchen under the pretense of refilling her tea. I stood at the counter for a moment with my hands flat on the surface, just breathing. Then I went back in and sat down and asked her, as calmly as I could, if she remembered the name of the bank where she had her savings account. She did. She's 81, but she remembers things like that. She told me the bank, the branch, even the name of the woman who helped her open the account decades ago. I asked her if she'd be okay for a little while if I made some calls. She said, "Take your time, honey. I'm just glad to be somewhere warm." I had to leave the room again after she said that. The first call I made was to my mother's sister, my aunt on the other side of the family, someone with no connection to my uncle. Someone I trusted. She's a retired paralegal, and she picks up on the second ring at 7 in the morning, like it's nothing unusual. I told her what happened. I told her everything my grandmother had told me. I told her about the medication, the phone, the money. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You need to call Adult Protective Services today. Not tomorrow, today." I didn't know much about Adult Protective Services at the time. I knew it existed. I didn't know what it actually did or how it worked. My aunt explained it to me while I paced around my kitchen in my bare feet. That APS investigates reports of elder abuse and neglect, that financial exploitation is one of the most common forms they deal with, that the call is confidential, that they can move quickly when there's an immediate concern, and that the fact that my grandmother had been left on my porch without her medication in 41-degree weather without a coat was, in her words, more than enough to open a case. I also called the bank that morning. I explained the situation as clearly as I could, told them I was concerned about possible financial exploitation of an elderly account holder, and asked if there was a process to flag the account while an investigation was underway. The woman I spoke to was calm and professional, and she said yes, there was a process, and that I should come in person with my grandmother as soon as possible. We were at the bank by 10 a.m. My grandmother sat across from a bank manager and gave her verbal permission to share account information with me. What the manager pulled up. I watched my grandmother's face when she saw the numbers. She didn't say anything. She just stared at the screen for a long moment and then looked down at her hands. In the past 22 months, $43,000 had been withdrawn from her savings account. Some in large chunks, some in smaller amounts, spaced out. The kind of pattern that might not trigger an alert on its own. The current balance was a little under $48,000, less than half of what she'd had. She hadn't authorized any of it. She hadn't known any of it was happening. The withdrawals had been made by my uncle, who had been given signatory access when she agreed to let him help manage her finances after her stroke. The bank manager flagged the account and referred us to their fraud department. She also gave us a printed statement going back 2 years. I folded that statement and put it in my bag, and I still have it. The APS caseworker came to my house the next afternoon. I want to say something about her, because I think people have a certain image in their head when they hear government caseworker. And she was nothing like that image. She was thorough and she was kind and she spoke directly to my grandmother, not over her or around her. She asked my grandmother questions and listened to the answers and took notes, and when my grandmother got emotional at one point, the caseworker just waited, quietly, without rushing her. She told us that what we were describing, withholding medication, financial exploitation, and the incident of being left on a porch in the cold without adequate clothing or notice, constituted elder abuse under the law. She said the financial piece, given the documented withdrawals, could also constitute criminal fraud. She asked my grandmother if she wanted to pursue all available options. My grandmother said yes. I want to be honest about what the next few weeks were like, because it wasn't a clean process. It wasn't a montage. My uncle called me the same day the APS report was filed. I don't know how he found out so quickly, but he did. And he was furious. He told me I had no idea what I was talking about. He told me my grandmother was confused and had always been confused about money. He told me I'd regret this. I recorded that call. I'd had the recording app on my phone for almost a year, ever since a situation with the previous landlord. That call turned out to be very useful later. My aunt, his wife, called me 3 days after that. She was calmer, but the message was the same. Drop it. This was a family matter. No one needed to bring outsiders in. She said my grandmother had agreed to the arrangement. She said I was causing unnecessary stress for an old woman who just wanted peace. What she didn't know was that my grandmother was sitting 10 feet away from me when I took that call. My grandmother heard everything. My grandmother heard everything. My grandmother asked me to hand her my phone when the call ended. She called her own attorney, one she'd had for 20 years, a man she'd trusted, who had written her original will and handled her affairs for decades before she turned things over to my uncle. He picked up on the third ring. She told him everything in a clear, steady voice, and when she was done, he said he'd file for emergency guardianship review within the week. He was faster than that. He filed within 3 days. The court process is the part people always want me to summarize quickly, and I understand why. It's complicated and not as satisfying as a single dramatic scene. But I think the details matter, so I'm going to give them. My uncle hired his own attorney. He argued that my grandmother's original agreement to let him manage her finances was legitimate and that the withdrawals were authorized. His attorney submitted some paperwork, account access agreements, signed forms. My grandmother's attorney looked at those forms carefully and pointed out that 2 of them appeared to have been signed on dates when my grandmother was in the hospital following her stroke, physically unable to have signed them. A handwriting expert was brought in. The analysis concluded that the signatures on those 2 documents were inconsistent with my grandmother's known handwriting samples. The judge froze my uncle's access to all accounts associated with my grandmother immediately. The guardianship hearing was 6 weeks after that. My grandmother testified. She was clear, composed, and detailed. She remembered dates and names and account numbers. She talked about asking for her medication and being ignored. She talked about her phone being shut off. She talked about the morning she was driven to my house and left on the porch without a word of explanation or a coat. The judge granted emergency guardianship to me. Permanent guardianship hearing was scheduled for 90 days out, at which point my uncle could contest. He chose not to contest. His attorney withdrew from the case 2 weeks before the hearing date. The court also ordered a full forensic accounting of my grandmother's finances for the past 2.5 years and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. That process is still ongoing. I can't say more about it than that. What I can say is that the $43,000, the forensic accountant traced most of it, where it went, how it was spent. That documentation is now part of a civil suit that my grandmother's attorney filed separately. My grandmother has lived with me for 7 months now. We have a routine. She does her crossword puzzle in the morning while I make coffee. She comes with me to the grocery store on Saturdays and has strong opinions about which brand of crackers is worth buying. She got a new doctor who did a full review of her medications and found that the dosing on 2 of them had been slightly off for over a year. Something that would have been caught at the appointments she'd been asking to be taken to. She's better now. Not in a dramatic way, just in the way that comes from being somewhere safe and being treated like a person. Some people, when I've told parts of this story, ask me whether I feel guilty. About reporting my own family. About what happened to my uncle as a result. I've thought about this a lot, and the honest answer is, I don't. Not for any of it. What I feel is something closer to grief. Grief for the version of my family I thought I had. Grief for my grandmother's money that she saved her entire life and may only partially recover. Grief for the years of my grandfather's life insurance that paid for things I'll never know about. But guilt? No. You don't feel guilty for turning on a light in a room that had been dark for too long? The morning she arrived, after the bank and the calls and the caseworker had all been sorted, I sat with her in the living room while it got dark outside. She had a quilt over her lap that she'd noticed in the hall closet and asked if she could use. I said, of course. She looked around the room for a while, and then she said, "You know, I had a feeling about you. Even when you were small, I always thought you were going to be someone I could count on." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't, really. I just reached over and held her hand, and we sat there together until it was time for dinner. I've thought a lot about the moment I almost didn't check my phone. 11 minutes. That's how long my grandmother stood on my porch in 41-degree weather before I opened that door. 11 minutes, because I was tired and I almost rolled over and went back to sleep. I think about that sometimes, how close the whole thing came to going differently. How many people in situations like hers never get that door opened at all? What I've come to understand, slowly, is that what happened to my grandmother wasn't a sudden thing. It was gradual. It was a pattern of small decisions made by someone who believed he wouldn't be caught, or maybe believed that what he was doing wasn't really wrong. That managing someone's money meant it was also yours to use. That keeping an old woman comfortable and fed meant you'd earned the rest. That kind of thinking doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up one day in a dramatic scene. It shows up in a phone bill that goes unpaid, in a prescription that doesn't get refilled, in a savings account that gets a little lighter every few weeks until the person it belonged to has less than half of what she started with. My grandmother worked her entire life. She was careful with money, in a way that people who grew up with very little tend to be. That $90,000 wasn't just a number. It was decades of discipline, of choosing not to spend, of putting something away for later. When I think about what was taken from her, I don't just think about the dollar amount. I think about the years behind it. Here's what I believe, and I'm not speaking about anything beyond the observable world when I say it. The choices we make accumulate. My uncle made choices, consistently, over more than 2 years, that prioritized his own comfort over an 81-year-old woman's security and health. Those choices left a paper trail. They left a pattern visible to a forensic accountant, to a judge, to a handwriting expert. The thing about taking from someone quietly and slowly is that quiet and slow still leaves evidence. The records existed. The withdrawals were dated. The forged signatures didn't hold up. He thought he was being careful. He wasn't careful enough, because I don't think he ever genuinely believed he'd be held accountable. That's the thing about people who do harm in private. They tend to assume the private will stay that way. It didn't. What I hope, if there's anything useful in this story at all, is that someone watching recognizes something. Maybe it's a medication that keeps not getting refilled. Maybe it's a parent who seems vague about their own finances. Maybe it's a phone call that goes unreturned for too long. These things are easy to explain away individually. Together, there's something else. My grandmother is doing her crossword puzzle right now. She's drinking her coffee. She'll probably beat me at Scrabble later this week and feel very pleased about it. She deserved this, not as a reward for suffering, but as the simple baseline that was always supposed to be hers. We don't always get to protect the people we love from everything. But sometimes we get to open the door in time. That has to count for something.